Kevin, come on now, buddy. We'll wrap it up. We need what you're going to bring us today, and it's timely.
Thank you, Rob. Well, today we're going to look at one of the most important leadership principles ever introduced. Every leader that you respect follows this principle, and every leader that you don't doesn't. If you want to be a leader worth following, you'll follow this principle. You see, Jesus came to introduce something new to the world, for the world, and it turned the world upside down. Like Rob said, we're in week 3 of our series, Upside Down, where we're answering the question, what did Jesus come to do? And it's a question that's closely connected with who is Jesus. These are questions that were important for the people back then, and they were wrestling and answering these questions, and they're important questions for us to be able to answer today. Now, week 1, we looked and talked about how Jesus came to bring us life through relationship with Him. He's our good shepherd, leading us to a place of wholeness and life. And then last week, we looked at how Jesus came to create a purpose-filled community marked by love and power. He's taking those of us as we encounter Him, and He's building something. He's building a spiritual body, a spiritual family, a group of citizens which are called to represent Him in this world. And this week, we're going to see that Jesus wants to take that community and He wants to create a serving revolution. Now, when Jesus came into the world, the religious systems of the 1st and 2nd century were very clearly top down. And in fact, in a lot of ways, they were modeled on the power and authority systems in the world around them. In fact, in many ways, they were enmeshed with those same systems. And it's not really that different today. And in fact, the Jewish religious leaders were clearly more worried about maintaining their own power and their own position and not upsetting the Romans than they were about caring for the people that were under their care. And Jesus comes into that, and we see that He's about to turn things upside down. So today, if you'll grab a Bible, if you get on the Grace Fishers app, you can follow along in the sermon notes. I want to say hello to those that are online. We're going to be in John chapter 11. It's page 893 if you're using one of our Bibles, and we're going to go there, and then we're going to jump over to Mark 10. You'll want to hold your place because then we'll jump back to John. So a little bit of context of the section of Jesus' life that we're going to see today. Jesus has done one of His most controversial miracles. It's created a lot of turbulence because He's raised a man named Lazarus from the dead. Now, Lazarus lived in a small town called Bethany, and he was pretty well known in the town and in the surrounding area. But that's not what made his this miracle so controversial. You see, Jesus had waited. Jesus had gotten word that Lazarus was sick, and He waited to come. And in fact, by the time Jesus got there, Lazarus had died, and he had been in the tomb for several days. Probably it was the 4th day when Jesus arrived. So Lazarus wasn't just dead. Lazarus was dead. He was in the tomb, wrapped up, and he was dead. Now, part of the reason that we think that Jesus waited is because in that day, they believed that when someone died, their spirit left their body and kind of hovered around their body for about 3 days, and maybe it would go in and out of their body, and then after 3 days, it would depart from the body, never to return. And so this miracle for Jesus is a notch above. A couple of weeks ago, we looked at how Jesus raised a little girl who had just died. This is a whole nother level. And so Bethany, this town where Jesus has done it, has become a tourist attraction. And this man, Lazarus, that Jesus raised from the dead, becomes a bit of a celebrity. And we begin to see the religious leaders, these Jewish religious leaders, are getting concerned because what they understand is that Jesus has done something significant. And again, the significance is often missed on us. And they realized if they don't begin to deal with this, they're going to continue to have a problem. So in John chapter 11, verse 46, we see this. Then the leading priests and the Pharisees called the high council together. What are we going to do, they ask each other. This man certainly performs many miracles. If we allow him to go on like this, soon everyone will believe in him. then the Roman army will come and destroy both our temple and our nation." So they were concerned that what Jesus was doing was going to displace them, and their fear was that if there was any turmoil, that Rome would come in. And then we see this crowd beginning to form, and we see it in John chapter 12, verse 9. "When all the people heard of Jesus' arrival, see he was coming back through Bethany, they flocked to see him and also to see Lazarus, the man that Jesus had raised from the dead. Then the leading priests decided to kill Lazarus too, for it was because of him that many of the people had deserted them and believed in Jesus." Now, just a reminder, if you lived in the first century, these people's belief was based on what they saw. They were eyewitnesses to what Jesus had done. Many of these people had seen Lazarus come out of the tomb. Now, Jesus is on his way through Bethany. He's actually headed Jerusalem. Bethany's just a couple of miles outside the city. And he's there for Passover, which is one of their largest celebrations, and there's going to be lots of pilgrims there. But it's clear that many people have come to see Jesus as well. In fact, he may be even more popular than Passover. And we know that this is Jesus' last trip into the city before his death. And we're going to jump over now to Mark 10. It's in page 839 if you're using one of our Bibles. But we continue the story. It says, "They were on their way up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. The disciples were filled with awe, and the people following behind were overwhelmed with fear. Taking the 12 disciples aside, Jesus once more began to describe everything that was about to happen to him." You see, Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem, and you see the disciples, it says they were in awe. And I think there were two things going on. First of all, they were excited by the popularity that Jesus had, and they were kind of on their way into the city amongst all these pilgrims. But there was also a sense of uncertainty, and you see that in the crowd that followed. It says they were filled with fear. They knew the danger that was there for Jesus because the Jewish ruling authorities had issued a proclamation that anybody that saw Jesus was supposed to report him and that they were going to arrest him. And you have to remember, this isn't a day, then there weren't pictures of people typically, and so the authorities would have needed people's help to point out Jesus and eventually arrest him. And so it's in that moment that Jesus pulls his disciples aside and he begins to tell them, he begins to kind of pull them out of the crowd, and he wants to kind of remind them one more time about what's about to happen. What you have to realize, this is the third time that he said this to them. So he says, "Guys, listen. We're going up to Jerusalem where the Son of Man," that's a title that Jesus is using to refer to himself, "will be betrayed to the leading priests and the teachers of religious law. They will sentence him to die, and they will hand him over to the Romans." And then he goes on. "They will mock him, spit on him, flog him with a whip, and kill him. But after 3 days, he'll rise again." Now, his disciples don't get it. What Jesus is telling them doesn't fit with kind of the narrative that they believe both about what this Jewish Messiah is going to be doing. They see his popularity. And so I think they must think that Jesus is speaking metaphorically, that he's saying something like, "Hey, this is going to be hard, guys. We're going to have to buck it up." But again, Jesus is trying to tell them, and he clearly wants them to know what's going to happen before it's going to happen. But it's clear they don't fully understand because of what we see happen next. Two of his disciples, actually two of his more prominent disciples, take this opportunity to pull Jesus aside right after he says this, right in this moment. And it says this in Mark 10, verse 35. "Then James and John, the son of Zebedee, came over and spoke to him. 'Teacher,' they said, we want you to do us a favor. What's your request?' And they replied, 'When you sit on your glorious throne, we want to sit in your places of honor next to you, one at your right and the other at your left.'" See, James and John, they're not really sure what Jesus is saying. I'm not sure what all this spitting and mocking and all that, but before we get there to Jerusalem and before you step into your position of power, we want to make sure we've secured our spots right next to you. They clearly don't get what's about to happen. Now, Jesus tells them, "Look, you guys don't know what you're asking." They say, "Yeah, we do," but clearly they don't. Well, I think the disciples must have headed out again, and I'm not sure that all the disciples overheard because it says they were on their way, but eventually they began to figure out, at least one of them must have overheard, and they must have figured out what James and John were asking, because then this happens in verse 41. It says, when the other 10 disciples, or when the 10 other disciples heard what James and John had asked, they were indignant. So Jesus has to stop the journey again. This is turning out to be a long 2 miles to walk from Bethany to Jerusalem, as Jesus has to keep pulling them aside. So Jesus called them together and said, you know what the rulers in this world, that the rulers in this world lord it over their people, and officials flaunt their authority over those under them. He's saying, guys, you know how this works. Those at the top have all the power, and they use all that power and all of that authority for their own benefit. They leverage it for themselves. But he goes on, but among you it will be different. Whoever wants to be leader among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be the slave of everyone else. And these are words that we can take home, that we can take to work, we can take to school. Jesus is saying resources and power in my kingdom are going to be managed differently. And he kind of asks them the question, who wants to be greatest? Now, it's not bad to want to be great. It's clear James and John, they're already thinking about being great. And it's true the other disciples, you kind of see it's like James and John already raised their hands. They want to be great. And as Jesus is asking them and looking around, it's kind of like you sheepishly see the other disciples' hands going up. And I think the hands dropped pretty quickly when Jesus says to them, you get to be great by going to the back of the line, by being a servant. And you get to be great by being a slave of everyone else. That's the back of the line. And then he adds this, for even the Son of Man, again, he's referring to himself, came not to be served, but to serve others and give his life as a ransom for many. Friends, our communities and our families would be transformed if we practice Jesus' simple call to us. Jesus is saying, I'm not asking you to lay down your life for me. I'm leveraging my life for yours. But it's clear, again, they have no idea what he's talking about. So now we're going to jump back to John chapter 13 this time, because Jesus is about to give them an illustration that they will never forget. It's in John chapter 13, verse 4. It says that Jesus knew that the Father had given him authority over everything, and that he had come from the Father, or come from God, and would return to God. Jesus was clear on who he was, and it's from that place of authority and position that Jesus does what he's about to do. So he got up from the table, he took off his robe, he wrapped a towel around his waist, and he poured water into a basin. And then he began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that he had around them. Now remember, ancient streets were mostly unpaved. They were dirty, full of trash, and there were animals everywhere. There were dogs and just all sorts of animals, and you know what that means. Add to that, they wore sandals, sweaty feet in the hot sun, and we can't fully imagine or grasp how shocking this was about what Jesus is about to do. Just to give you some examples, it was against Jewish law to make a fellow Jewish servant, make him wash your feet. And it was against Roman law to even force your slave to remove your sandals. So you had to remove your sandals yourself if your slave was going to wash your feet. Now, often people washed their own feet, but if somebody washed somebody else's feet, it was clear that the person below was washing the feet of the person that was higher. So this was a task. If you didn't do it yourself, it was reserved for servants or slaves, or it might have been reserved for the women and the children in the household. Now, occasionally you would have a case where a host, if they had an especially esteemed guest that was coming to their home, would humble themselves and wash their feet. There is never a recorded instance of a rabbi washing his disciples' feet. To do so would have been considered shameful. And so that explains Peter's response. When Jesus comes to him, it says, when Jesus came to Simon Peter, Peter said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? I think Peter was so surprised he didn't know what to say. And Peter was a man who always seemed to know what to say. But Jesus replied, you don't understand now what I'm doing, but someday you will. And Peter responded by saying, "No, you will never wash my feet." In fact, the Greek is really strong here. It simply says, "No, you won't." Peter didn't want to allow Jesus to do something that would bring shame on Jesus. And so Peter's trying to protect Jesus. But Jesus eventually convinces Peter that he needs to do this. Now, washing someone's feet takes a while. I would imagine washing 12 pairs of feet as Jesus slowly moved around the group took a long time. I doubt anybody said anything. But I imagine they never forgot the image of their rabbi kneeling before them because they understood what his hands and the power that those hands could wield, and they saw him humbling himself like a common servant or slave. And you have to remember that among those 12 was Judas, the man who was plotting to betray Jesus. And Jesus knew that he was plotting to do that. And Jesus could have easily have dismissed Judas like he does a little bit later in the meal and just humbled himself before the 11. But Jesus chooses to serve even the one that he knows is going to betray him. Jesus never calls us to do something that he hasn't done himself. In fact, Jesus reminds them of this when he says, "I've given you an example to follow. Do as I have done for you." Now, Jesus reminds them of his position as their teacher and master, and anything that he models is expected of them as well. It's like Jesus is reminding them that, hey, when you become important and you have positions of authority, when you begin to start to think you're something, remember this night and remember what I did for you. Well, I'm not sure that they fully got it that night. Obviously, it's stuck in their head and their memory, but I don't know that they fully comprehended, and I know it didn't work their way into their hearts. Because in the Gospel of Luke records some details that we don't have in these other two accounts. Luke records that dispute, that argument that had broken out early, broke out again after dinner about who was going to be the greatest. But they eventually remembered Jesus' lesson later. After his death and resurrection, after the Holy Spirit came upon them, in the months that following, they finally got it. In fact, the first recorded problem in the local church was in the book of Acts chapter 6, and it was these same disciples who didn't get this lesson were spending so much time serving and caring the widows that were a part of their community that they finally had to stop doing that because they weren't spending the time teaching these number of new converts that were coming into their community. And so they had to appoint other people to serve and take care of the widows so they can do the things that only they could do. They could spend time teaching and praying. And so what started out as appalling to this Jewish and Roman and Greek cultures over time became appealing. In the early days of the church in those first centuries, Christians began to notice that there were lepers that were outcasts from society, and they began to think about how can we care for these people who were outcasts and don't have money, and they created these spaces where the lepers could come and be cared for. And they created what we now know are hospitals. And through the ages as well, like the Middle Ages, for example, when the plague would sweep through an area, the Christians were often the ones that would stay behind in the villages and care for the sick, in many cases themselves becoming sick and dying. But because they had a greater hope, they were willing to stay behind and care for those in need. And I'm also reminded in the many ways that the church throughout the years have cared for vulnerable children. And ultimately, Jesus' example and this teaching and what he modeled has changed our world. It's grown from this little Jewish cult with a crucified Savior in a small corner of the world. It's spread throughout the world, and it's changed many things, but including it's changed how we think about what a good leader looks like. And now when you see it, you admire it. You say Jesus came to create a serving revolution for the world because he knew it was one of the ways that people would begin to understand that he is who he said he was. And when I think about a great example of somebody who serves like this, I think of a couple that I met a few years ago named Jed and Kim Johnson. Now, Jed and Kim happen to lead a ministry called Wide Awake International that's located in Ukraine. It also happens to be a ministry that Grace Fishers has a partnership with through one of our partners, Hands of Hope. And Hands of Hope happens to be a ministry that my wife leads, and so we've got kind of a close connection with this. But I want to share with you a little bit about Jed and Kim's journey, about how they ended up serving in Ukraine. Which, by the way, I was planning to share this a little while ago, and then realized with the events of this week, their story seemed even more important. So in 2010, Jed and Kim were a happy, successful couple. They had a family of 4. They were living in Oregon, but they started to hear Jesus' voice calling them to take steps to care for vulnerable children. And so one of the first ways that they said yes to God was becoming foster parents. And the thing about saying yes to God, you've got to be careful when you do that, because when you say yes, he kind of cracks open your heart and he begins to open your heart to other things. And so through a series of circumstances, they found out about a young boy in Ukraine that they decided that they were going to adopt. Now, this adoption didn't go through. They were disappointed because this young boy was adopted by another family. But as they worked through the disappointment, they began to hear their Heavenly Father calling them to be a father and a mother to many boys and young men. And I'll say this, I got the chance to meet Jed several years ago in person. I don't know that I've ever met anybody that has embodied the Father's heart like he does. He was delighting over his young, disabled, adopted son, Vlad, who was at our house, and Vlad had just recently come from an institution, and Vlad was experiencing new life, and there was this proud dad in our home that loved him. But that was later in the story that happened. And so they felt this calling to do something to care for vulnerable children, and ultimately led them to explore going to Ukraine. And so they made a trip there to explore, to see what God was doing there. And it was there that they felt the door open and they had God's blessing. And so they packed up this family of 4 and they moved to Ukraine. And it was there that they started to work with young men that were disabled, that were being cared for in an institution. And they had this dream that they could take these men out of the institution and bring them into a family. And so some of those boys they've adopted and they've brought to their own family. And they've built a home for these young men that they can come into and become cared for by house parents and live more in a family setting. Now here's a picture of Jed and Kim's family, their growing family now. And in the process of kind of living in God's heart and adding to their family and growing and doing this building this young men's home, they're also building a community that shares the same heart that they have. For example, this community includes some single moms who have disabled young boys of their own. And their families have abandoned them in many cases because in Eastern Europe, having a disabled young boy or family member is considered shameful, and so they're encouraged to give them up to an institution. And they've also recruited high school and some college students who have a heart and go in with them into this institution where they still visit on a regular basis, and they care for the young boys that they can't pull out of the institution. And so they're building this community that shares their heart. Now, I was listening to their podcast last week as they were anticipating what might happen in Ukraine, and it was incredible to hear their courage and their desire to stay in Ukraine. In fact, Susie and part of her team had a phone call with them yesterday, so it was a little surreal to get to hear Jed as he was taking us a tour through his property and introducing these people that are a part of their community that have kind of left their homes. They live outside the city in a smaller village. It's a little bit more safe, and so they're filling up every bedroom in this home with the people in their community. There's 36 people now living in their home and in this young men's home, and they're going to eventually create some temporary refuge for some Bible college students that need a safer place as well. But for now, Jed and Kim are staying in Ukraine. And it's partly because it's not easy to travel with a group of young men who are disabled, but it's partly out of a sense of conviction. On the call yesterday, Jed said something I'll never forget. He said, if the church isn't the body of Christ in times like these, we have no business opening our mouths. Now, if you are curious to hear some updates on the ground from Jed and Kim, they're posting on their YouTube channel every day just kind of what they're experiencing. So it's kind of a fascinating look at a kind of an up-close and personal perspective of the war. There's also links in the Grace Fishers app to their ministry if you want to find more about them. But even though Ukraine is in the news today, and overall it feels far away, and most of us are never going to get called to live and serve in a foreign country, and I think in some ways it's almost harder and easier to serve right here simply by loving your neighbor at home, at school, at work. And wherever you are, if you're a leader or a person of influence, and we all have influence, we should all be asking, how can I help? How can I leverage me for you? How can I bring the resources that God has blessed me with to serve you? It's something that we don't ask enough. And imagine what would happen in our workplaces, in our homes, if we began to ask that question. And I was thinking about a little more locally about a story where I saw this lived out, and I was thinking of a story of somebody from within our congregation, and it happened in May of 2020. Heidi Porterfield, who's a part of us, happened to reach out to a woman after she posted on an Indiana foster parent Facebook page. This lady, even though she was an experienced foster parent, she and her husband were experiencing some challenges as they fostered this new little girl for the first time, and they needed some advice and support. So Heidi didn't know this lady, but she went ahead and introduced herself through some private messages, and she offered to get them help through something called the care community, and also offered to help get them connected through a local church that had care communities. Now, if you're not familiar with what a care community is, it's a group of people that come together that provide practical support for a foster family. You see, a foster family brings a child in their home and they care for this child 24/7. And often, especially during the adjustment period for a foster family and for their foster child, they need a little bit of extra support. And that's where this care community comes in to provide the support. Now, you can probably guess that this local church was Grace Fishers, and that couple happened to be Jen and Matt Meeks, who are now part of our congregation. And you might recognize them. This is a picture of the Meeks family. And this is what Jen shared with me about their experience about coming to Grace Fishers. She said, since moving to Fishers in 2018, we've been looking for a church to call home. And after the response from Heidi, we decided to check out Grace Fishers. As we walked in for the first time, we were greeted by name, and it immediately felt like home. And that's because people from their care community knew they might visit, and so they were there and kind of ready to go. And she added, we enjoy the structure of Sunday services. The people that we've met and have connected with at Grace Fishers on a personal level have kept us coming back. Grace Fishers has impacted our whole family. It helps us to instill the morals and ethics that we value as a family as we raise our children. It's also been an integral part of our relationship as husband and wife as we look forward to the classes being offered that will help us grow spiritually and help us enhance our relationship. And through being part of one of the many care communities at Grace Fishers, we were connected with other foster parents that we've become very close with. Our personal care community has been beyond thoughtful with weekly meals, prayer support, and as being willing and desire to do more for us. You see, this was a group of people, or this couple was a family that was isolated and they needed care, and somebody took the step to reach out for them and share Christ's love for them. You never know what a small step like what Heidi did to reach out to somebody that she didn't know would have on their lives. Reaching out to somebody she didn't know, and a whole family was impacted. You know, serving like this rocked the world once, and it can again if we simply take Jesus' words to heart, wrap a towel around our own waist, and begin to serve and love like Jesus did.